Maybe if your daddy taught you respect instead of abandoning you, you'd know your place by now. Captain Conrad Ashworth's words hit harder than his fists as he shoved Dominic Vale against the cell wall. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in the sterile prison corridor. The midday sun filtered through the high windows, illuminating the fresh bruises on Dominic's dark skin while 3 guards formed a semicircle, blocking any view from the cameras. Ashworth adjusted his long-sleeved uniform shirt, savoring the moment. "Been in the system since you were 12, haven't you? Guess some people are just born garbage." What none of them realized was that the father Ashworth was mocking had been searching for his lost son for 23 years, and he was standing just 50 feet away in the warden's office, about to receive lab results that would shatter his world. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Dominic Vale leaned against a stone wall. He didn't want to let the creep Ashworth see how badly he was breaking. At the age of 23, he had learned that survival meant losing everything but his dignity. Riverside Correctional had him for 6 months. This taught him that Captain Conrad Ashworth hated black inmates. However, he had the feeling the man's cruelty was reserved especially for Dominic. The man, wrongly convicted of armed robbery, went through a world of horror with Ashworth torturing him almost every moment, feeling like drowning in slow motion. "Do you believe you are tough, Vale?" Coffee breath emanated from Ashworth as he pressed closer. The excitement of absolute power flushed his pale face. "Your kind always thinks they can stare us down. I've broken boys like you for 15 years. Dominic's orange prison shirt was yanked from his neck in twisting motions, hurting his neck. "What will that attitude get you when no one is watching?" The remaining guards laughed the same. Officer Linda Frost was a stocky woman in her 40s, wearing a red corrections uniform. She crossed her muscular arms and shook her head. "Some individuals never learn, Captain." Her voice had the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of familiarity with violence. Sitting behind his mahogany desk in the administrative wing of the prison, 50 feet away, a man named Warden Thomas Ashworth was overseeing his monthly reports of incidents. At the age of 51, Thomas always walked around like a man who believes in rehabilitation, not punishment. His blue suit jacket sat on the seat behind him, and above him on the wall, a green dress shirt hung. The man's weathered face, caught in the light filtering through his office's windows, told tales of disappointment and hope. Thomas had no idea that his younger brother Conrad was currently terrorizing an inmate in the corridor outside. The soundproofing in the administrative wing was excellent, designed to keep the warden focused on policy and reform rather than the daily realities of prison life. Thomas flipped through reports showing decreased violence statistics, unaware that Conrad had simply gotten better at hiding his actions. The phone rang, interrupting Thomas's review. Detective Omar Hassan's voice came through clearly. "Warden Ashworth, I have those DNA results from the cold case database, the sample from Inmate Vale that Dr. Donovan submitted." Thomas barely registered the call as routine. The state had been collecting DNA from all inmates to help solve cold cases, a progressive policy Thomas had championed. "Send them over, Detective. Always happy to help solve old cases." Back in the corridor, Conrad's abuse was escalating. He grabbed Dominic's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle until Dominic's knees buckled. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting intermittent shadows across the scene. "You know what I think, Vale. I think you're exactly where you belong. Trash belongs with trash." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And if you ever think about filing a complaint, remember that nobody cares what happens to people like you." Dominic's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. Speaking would only make things worse. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during his first week when Conrad had orchestrated 3 days in solitary confinement after Dominic had dared to ask why he was being singled out. The answer was obvious but unspoken. Conrad Ashworth was a racist who used his badge to inflict legal torture on black inmates. Dr. Rachel Donovan appeared at the end of the corridor. Her red medical coat, a bright contrast against the institutional gray walls. Her brown pants and professional demeanor commanded respect even from the guards. At 38, Rachel had spent 5 years as the prison's head physician, and she'd grown increasingly suspicious of the patterns she was seeing. "Excuse me, Captain Ashworth. I need to examine Inmate Vale for his routine medical check." Conrad's face twisted with annoyance, but he couldn't refuse a direct medical request. He released Dominic's wrist and stepped back, smoothing his uniform. "Of course, Doctor. We were just having a conversation about respect." His smile was cold and calculated. "Vale here was just telling us how much he appreciates the structure we provide." Immediately, Dr. Donovan's trained eye took in the finger marks on Dominic's wrist and the swelling of his left eye that had not been there yesterday. For months, she had been keeping a record of the injuries he sustained, but proving systematic abuse in a cover-up culture was very hard. "Mr. Vale, please follow me. Let's get you examined." As they headed towards the medical wing, Conrad called to them. "Don't allow him to deceive you, Doc. These prisoners will say anything in order to gain attention." The laughter of the other guards echoed off the concrete walls again, like breaking glass. Dr. Donovan carefully noted each injury while Dominic sat on the examination table in the medical examination room. The bright overhead lights illuminated every mark, bruise, and peculiarly shaped body with clinical detail. "Mr. Vale, this is the 3rd occurrence this week. It has become harder to ignore." Dominic looked up at her with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "Doc, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but making waves just makes things worse. Captain Ashworth runs this place when the warden's not looking, and he's made it clear what happens to people who cross him." Rachel's heart ached for the young man in front of her. She'd read his file, adopted as an infant by Maria Santos, a single mother who'd given him every opportunity to succeed. Honor student in high school, 2 years of community college before the arrest that destroyed his future. The armed robbery conviction never made sense to her. Dominic didn't fit the profile, and the evidence had been suspiciously convenient. "You were adopted as a baby according to your intake file." Dominic nodded, his expression softening slightly at the mention of his adoptive mother. "Maria Santos raised me like I was her own blood. She still visits every week, still believes I'm innocent. It's the only thing that keeps me going some days." Dr. Donovan made a note in his file, not realizing she was documenting information that would soon become crucial evidence. "I need to collect a DNA sample for the cold case database. It's routine for all inmates now." The small vial seemed insignificant as she labeled it with Dominic's information, but it contained the key to a truth that would destroy Conrad Ashworth's world. Back in his office, Thomas Ashworth was reading the email from Detective Hassan when his blood turned to ice. The DNA analysis had revealed something impossible. According to the lab, inmate Dominic Vale was his biological son. Thomas stared at the screen, reading the results again and again, his hands shaking. This couldn't be real. But the memories came flooding back. Jennifer Williams, his high school girlfriend who disappeared when they were both 17. She'd been pregnant, but her family had moved away before Thomas could convince them to let him help. Thomas had searched for Jennifer and their child for years, hiring private investigators and checking hospital records across 3 states. He'd never stopped wondering about the son or daughter he'd never met. Never stopped carrying the guilt of being too young and scared to fight harder when Jennifer's family had shut him out. Now that child was in his prison, being brutalized by his own brother. The irony was devastating. While Thomas had spent decades implementing progressive reforms and fighting for inmate rights, His own flesh and blood was suffering systematic abuse 50 feet away. The moral complexity hit him like a physical blow. He was a good man who'd unknowingly enabled the torture of his own son. Conrad had no idea that the young black man he'd been tormenting was his nephew. His racism ran so deep that he'd never bothered to learn anything personal about his victims beyond their capacity for suffering. To Conrad, Dominic Vale was just another target, another opportunity to exercise the power that made him feel superior to the successful brother he'd always resented. Dr. Donovan put the DNA in an evidence bag, with date and time inscribed on the outside of the bag. She had no way of knowing that this commonplace procedure would expose many years of cruelty and undo a family, one based on secrets and lies. The fluorescent lights buzzed while she worked on the forms, and the prison noises reverberated in the background. As the sun began to set outside the high windows, casting long shadows across the corridors, 3 men went about their routines completely unaware that their lives were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. Thomas Ashworth sat in his office, staring at DNA results that proved his greatest failure as a father. Conrad Ashworth planned tomorrow's torment for the nephew he didn't know existed, and Dominic Vale returned to his cell, carrying the genetic truth that would soon transform him from victim to the center of a justice story that would change everything. The lab results were already making their way through the system, carrying with them the power to expose not just individual cruelty, but the systematic failures that had allowed it to flourish in plain sight. Captain Conrad Ashworth made a few adjustments to his short-sleeved uniform shirt as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the prison corridor. It had been 3 weeks since he first touched Dominic Vale, and what began as brutal spontaneity had now developed into something much more calculated and sinister. Dominic walked down the corridor in his orange jumpsuit with a blue shirt on, his hands locked, and on his way to breakfast. However, Conrad had different plans. He nodded to Officer Linda Frost. She was in her 40s, wearing the common red prison staff shirt with dark pants. Her blonde hair was tied back in a bun, and her expression was cold. Conrad had a drawl that echoed off the concrete walls of the room. Natural light streamed in from windows high above us. Well, look who finally shows up. You seem a little too comfortable for my liking. Dominic stared straight ahead, aware that speaking up would only infuriate Conrad more. In these cruel weeks, the boy learned that silence was his only weapon, but the captain's cruelty overwhelmed even that. "I'm talking to you, boy." Conrad's voice boomed as he stepped directly into Dominic's path. "When I speak, you answer. Your daddy never teach you manners? Oh wait, that's right. You ain't got no daddy." The words hit like physical blows. Conrad had discovered that taunting Dominic about his unknown parentage was particularly effective in breaking down his composure. What the captain didn't know was that each mention of absent fathers was unknowingly describing his own brother's loss. Officer Linda Frost moved to block Dominic's other side, trapping him between them in the brightly lit corridor. "Captain Ashworth asked you a question, inmate," she said, her voice lacking any warmth despite the overhead lighting that illuminated every harsh line of her face. "No, sir," Dominic finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "My father didn't teach me anything." Conrad's laugh was harsh and grating. "That's because worthless people like you come from worthless stock. Probably some drug dealer who knocked up your mama and ran off. Apple don't fall far from the tree, does it?" Down the hall, Calvin Price watched the interaction unfold from behind his cell bars. Calvin was a 40-year-old black man, serving time for check fraud, wearing the standard orange shirt and blue jacket of general population inmates. His hands gripped the bars as he witnessed yet another episode of Conrad's systematic torture of Dominic. Calvin had seen it all over the past 3 weeks. The denied meals, the mysterious falls downstairs, the extended periods in solitary confinement for infractions that other inmates would receive mere warnings for. Calvin wanted to speak up, wanted to report what he was seeing, but fear kept him silent. He'd heard the stories about what happened to inmates who crossed Captain Conrad Ashworth. Mysterious accidents, extended sentences for minor rule violations. Sometimes inmates would simply disappear into administrative segregation and emerge weeks later, broken and hollow-eyed. "Move along, Price," Officer Linda Frost called out, having noticed Calvin's attention. "Nothing to see here." Calvin reluctantly stepped back from his bars, but his ears remained tuned to the confrontation in the hallway. He heard the sound of flesh hitting concrete, followed by Conrad's voice. "Clumsy boy tripped again," Conrad announced loudly for anyone listening. "These floors can be real slippery when they're not properly maintained." 3 floors above, Warden Thomas Ashworth sat in his office, reviewing reformation proposals under the bright fluorescent lighting that illuminated his neat desk. Thomas wore a crisp green shirt and blue jacket, his graying hair perfectly combed as he studied statistics about recidivism rates. At 55, he was genuinely committed to transforming the prison system, believing that rehabilitation rather than punishment was the key to reducing crime. His computer screen displayed impressive numbers. Educational programs had increased by 30%, job training initiatives were showing real results, and overall violence in the prison had decreased under his leadership. What Thomas didn't know was that his statistics were carefully curated by his administrative staff, who filtered out reports that might complicate his reform narrative. A knock on his door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," Thomas called, looking up to see his assistant entering with a stack of reports. "Sir, the monthly incident reports are ready for your review," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "Overall, we're showing continued improvement in prisoner-staff relations." Thomas nodded in agreement. He was unaware that his brother had been abusing Dominic Vale in a systematic manner. All this was missing from the report because of a network of officers and administrators. They were all scared of Conrad's retaliation. Meanwhile, Dr. Rachel Donovan in the prison medical wing was getting concerned of what she was experiencing. The 38-year-old redcoat doctor, dressed elegantly in a professional attire, had dark hair that framed her face, which reflected compassion and worry. The medical wing is bright because of natural skylight. It helps her to examine. The injuries that she was documenting were certainly disturbing. Dominic Vale had appeared in her medical bay 7 times in 3 weeks. Bruised ribs from falling downstairs, a split lip from walking into a door, suspicious marks on his wrists from restraints applied during a struggle. Each incident report was signed by Captain Conrad Ashworth or one of his associates, each explanation technically plausible yet collectively forming a pattern that made Dr. Donovan's stomach turn. She had tried raising concerns with the prison administration, but her reports seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. Nurse Dorothy Simmons, an elderly woman in her blue medical jacket, had quietly warned her that previous medical staff who had been too curious about certain inmates' injuries had found their employment terminated for various administrative reasons. "Doctor, they're bringing in another one," Nurse Simmons announced, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much over her long career. Dr. Donovan looked up to see Officer Linda Frost escorting Dominic into the medical bay. His orange shirt was torn, and she could immediately see fresh abrasions on his face and arms. "Inmate Vale had another accident," Officer Frost announced, her tone suggesting this was routine. "Slipped in the shower area. Captain Ashworth wants him checked out to make sure there's no serious damage." Dr. Donovan's jaw tightened, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'll need to examine him privately, Officer Frost. Standard medical protocol." "I'll be right outside the door," replied Officer Frost, indicating who gets to decide on privacy around here. As Dr. Donovan began her examination under the medical lighting, she spoke quietly to Dominic. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Vale?" Dominic met her eyes briefly, and she saw something there that shattered her heart. It was more than pain. It was like emptiness, as bits of his humanity were being taken from him. "I'm fine, Doc," he whispered. "Just clumsy, I guess." Dr. Donovan consented and understood what to do. Though she couldn't push too hard without threatening them both, she could document. Every bruise, cut, or discolored mark is photographed and recorded in files apart from her medical notes. In a storage room that wasn't monitored by any cameras, Captain Conrad Ashworth was engaged in a discussion with a group of officers back in the general population area. In the fluorescent lights overhead, he outlined his expectations to his ever-expanding chain of conspirators. "Listen," Conrad said, rolling up his cuff of short-sleeve uniform shirt. "We have a problem with these bleeding heart liberals trying to turn our prison into a country club. But we aren't that stupid, right?" Officer Linda Frost nodded along with 3 other guards, all wearing their standard uniforms under the bright institutional lighting. These were officers Conrad had carefully selected, men and women who shared his views about maintaining order through fear, and had their own reasons for harboring resentment toward certain populations. "That boy Vale is getting too comfortable," Conrad continued. "Thinks he can just waltz around here like he owns the place. We need to remind him and others like him about the natural order of things." Conrad never revealed his inner motives behind the obsession with Dominic to his co-conspirators. Growing up, Conrad lived under the shadow of his older brother Thomas, who was the golden child who excelled at school, earned his parents' praise, and became professionally successful. All that Thomas received through promotion, praise, or newspaper articles about the progressive young warden was a personal affront to Conrad. Conrad had chosen to enter law enforcement as a means to prove to himself that he could be just as successful as his brother. However, this was not the career path he imagined for himself. He had received complaints, reprimands, and was transferred laterally until he eventually landed in Thomas's jurisdiction. The little brother, who had to prove his superiority, could not come to terms with the fact that he was not equal to the elder but, in fact, inferior. Taking out these frustrations on inmates like Dominic provided Conrad with a sense of power and control that was missing from other areas of his life. When he looked at young black men like Dominic, he saw everything he resented: potential, dignity, and an unwillingness to accept that they were lesser than him. Breaking that spirit became his mission. "Remember," Conrad told his assembled group, "accidents happen in prison. Inmates fight with each other. They're clumsy. They don't follow safety protocols. As long as we're all on the same page about what we see and don't see, we can maintain proper discipline in this facility." The officers nodded their understanding. They all had their own reasons for participating. Some shared Conrad's racial animosity, others were simply afraid of crossing him, and a few were motivated by the small financial incentives he provided for their cooperation. As the meeting broke up, none of them could have imagined that their systematic torture of Dominic Vale would soon expose a family secret that would destroy Conrad's life and transform their victim into the catalyst for sweeping changes throughout the entire prison system. Dr. Rachel Donovan finished treating Dominic's latest injuries and watched through her medical bay window as Officer Linda Frost escorted him back to his cell. The bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated her resolve. She would continue documenting everything, building a case that someone, somewhere, would eventually be forced to acknowledge. The systematic cruelty was escalating, but so was the evidence. And though none of them knew it yet, the DNA sample she had collected was already making its way through the system toward a revelation that would change everything. The fluorescent lights in Millbrook Correctional's West Wing cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor as Captain Conrad Ashworth adjusted his long-sleeved uniform shirt, a predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. 3 weeks of systematic torture had only strengthened his resolve to break the young black man who dared to maintain his dignity despite every cruelty inflicted upon him. "Today's the day, boys," Captain Conrad Ashworth announced to officers Linda Frost and Marcus Webb, both wearing short-sleeved police uniforms under the bright overhead lighting. "Vale's been getting too comfortable thinking he can survive my methods. Time to show him what real pain feels like." Officer Linda Frost, her red blouse visible beneath her unbuttoned uniform jacket, shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, the warden's doing his monthly tour today. Maybe we should keep things quiet." Captain Conrad Ashworth's eyes flashed with contempt. "My brother doesn't know how to handle animals like Vale. That's why I'm here to do the real work while he plays politics upstairs." In cell block D, Dominic Vale sat on his narrow bunk, his orange prison shirt torn from yesterday's accident in the laundry room. His green undershirt was stained with dried blood, but his dark eyes remained unbroken, focused on a crack in the ceiling that had become his meditation point during the endless hours of torment. Calvin Price watched from the adjacent cell, his own orange jumpsuit pristine compared to Dominic Vale's battle-worn appearance. For 3 weeks he had witnessed the escalating abuse, his conscience warring with his survival instincts. Every beating, every staged accident, every moment of psychological warfare had been building to something terrible. "Vale, you've got a medical appointment," Officer Linda Frost announced, her voice lacking its usual venom. The keys jangled as she unlocked the cell, avoiding eye contact with the young man who had become the target of their captain's obsession. Dominic Vale stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He had learned to read the signs, to prepare mentally for whatever fresh hell awaited him. As he walked through the corridor, natural light from the high windows illuminated his face, revealing the quiet strength that had kept him alive through weeks of torture. Dr. Rachel Donovan was reviewing medical files in the infirmary when the door burst open. Instead of the routine checkup she had scheduled, Officers Webb and Torres dragged in Dominic Vale's unconscious form, his orange shirt soaked in blood, his green undershirt completely torn away. "What happened?" Dr. Rachel Donovan demanded, her red medical coat catching the fluorescent light as she rushed to examine him. "Fell down some stairs," Officer Webb replied mechanically, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. Dr. Rachel Donovan's trained eyes immediately identified the pattern of injuries that had nothing to do with a fall. The precisely placed bruises, the defensive wounds on his hands, the swelling consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. This wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder. "Get out," she ordered, her voice steel beneath the professional calm. "All of you." Now, as the officers reluctantly left, Dr. Rachel Donovan worked frantically to stabilize Dominic Vale's vital signs. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, and the severity of his internal injuries terrified her. While administering IV fluids, she made a decision that would change everything. Reaching for her phone, she began documenting every injury, every bruise, every mark of torture that Captain Conrad Ashworth had inflicted. The camera flash illuminated wounds that told a story of systematic brutality, bruises in various stages of healing, evidence of repeated beatings over weeks, burns consistent with cigarette marks, ligature marks from restraints. This wasn't discipline. This was sadistic torture designed to break a human being's spirit. 20 minutes later, Dominic Vale's eyes fluttered open. Despite the pain coursing through his body, his first instinct was to assess his surroundings, to prepare for the next attack. When he saw Dr. Rachel Donovan's concerned face, something in her expression told him that this moment was different. "You're safe here," she whispered, checking his bandages. "I won't let them hurt you anymore." Meanwhile, Calvin Price paced his cell, his conscience finally overwhelming his fear. He had watched a good man being tortured for 3 weeks, and today's beating had crossed every line. The sound of Dominic Vale's body hitting the concrete, the sickening thuds of boots connecting with flesh, Captain Conrad Ashworth's racist taunts echoing through the corridor. It all played on repeat in his mind. When Dr. Rachel Donovan made her routine rounds later that afternoon, Calvin Price made his choice. "Doc," he called softly through the bars, "I need to talk to you about what's happening to Vale." Dr. Rachel Donovan approached his cell, her red coat bright under the overhead fluorescent lights. Something in Calvin Price's eyes told her this was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. "They're trying to kill him," Calvin Price whispered, glancing around nervously. "Captain Conrad Ashworth has been torturing him for weeks. Today wasn't an accident. They beat him unconscious in the shower room. I saw everything." Dr. Rachel Donovan's heart raced as Calvin Price detailed the systematic abuse, confirming everything she had suspected. The staged accidents, the food deprivation, the psychological warfare. It painted a picture of calculated cruelty that made her stomach turn. "Will you testify to this?" she asked. Calvin Price nodded, fear and determination warring in his expression. "Val doesn't deserve this. Nobody deserves what they're doing to him." Across the prison, guard Nathan Cole was having his own crisis of conscience. The muscular young officer had joined the prison system to make a difference, not to participate in torture. This morning's beating had shattered any remaining illusions about Captain Conrad Ashworth's methods. Nathan Cole had watched Captain Conrad Ashworth orchestrate the attack with clinical precision, selecting the location to avoid cameras, timing it to coincide with shift changes, coaching the other officers on their story. The casual racism, the pleasure Captain Conrad Ashworth took in inflicting pain, the complete dehumanization of Dominic Vale. It was everything Nathan Cole had sworn to stand against when he took his oath. The afternoon brought Warden Thomas Ashworth's monthly inspection tour. His blue jacket and professional demeanor, a stark contrast to the violence that had occurred just hours earlier. Thomas Ashworth prided himself on running a progressive facility, implementing reform programs, and maintaining strict standards for inmate treatment. He had no idea that his own brother was systematically torturing a young man just floors below his office. "How's morale in this wing, Conrad?" Warden Thomas Ashworth asked as they walked through cell block D, natural light streaming through the high windows. "Solid as always, Tommy," Captain Conrad Ashworth replied, using his brother's childhood nickname with calculated familiarity. "The inmates respect authority here. We maintain order through proper discipline." As they passed Dominic Vale's empty cell, Warden Thomas Ashworth noticed the blood stains on the floor that hadn't been completely cleaned up. "What happened here?" Captain Conrad Ashworth didn't miss a beat. "Inmate had a nosebleed. Medical took care of it. Nothing serious." Warden Thomas Ashworth nodded, trusting his brother's explanation completely. The irony was devastating. A father walking past evidence of his son's torture, prevented from recognizing the truth by familial trust and institutional blindness. That evening, Dr. Rachel Donovan sat in her office, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. In front of her lay two sealed envelopes, one containing DNA samples and medical records destined for the state crime lab, the other containing photographic evidence and testimony that would destroy careers and potentially save lives. The DNA sample had been collected weeks ago as part of a routine screening for cold case databases, but she had held onto it, waiting for the right moment. Now, with clear evidence of systematic abuse and a credible witness willing to testify, she was ready to act. She addressed the first envelope to Detective Omar Hassan, whose reputation for thorough investigations and moral integrity made him the perfect ally. The second envelope went to the State Attorney General's office, bypassing the local prosecutor who might be influenced by prison politics. 50 miles away, Detective Omar Hassan was working late in his office, reviewing cold case files under the harsh fluorescent lighting. His green shirt and blue jacket were wrinkled from a long day, but his dedication to justice kept him focused on the stack of DNA results that had just arrived from the state lab. One file in particular caught his attention, a decades-old case involving an abandoned infant at Mercy General Hospital. The DNA profile had triggered a match in the database, connecting to a current inmate at Millbrook Correctional. The coincidence seemed routine until he read the names involved: Dominic Vale, Thomas Ashworth. Detective Omar Hassan leaned back in his chair, the implications washing over him. The abandoned infant from 23 years ago had somehow ended up in the prison system, and the DNA match suggested a connection to the warden himself. This wasn't just a cold case resolution. This was potentially explosive information that could reshape everything about the current investigation he was about to begin. Back in the prison infirmary, Dominic Vale lay awake despite the pain medication, his mind focused not on his injuries, but on the strength that had carried him through 3 weeks of hell. Every beating had been designed to break his spirit, to make him submit to Captain Conrad Ashworth's racist ideology, to transform him from a man into a broken animal. Instead, each act of cruelty had forged his resolve stronger. He thought about his adoptive mother, Maria Santos, who had raised him with unconditional love and unwavering principles. He thought about the truth of his innocence, the knowledge that somewhere out there, the real perpetrator of the armed robbery remained free while he suffered for their crimes. Most importantly, he thought about the future, not just his own survival, but the possibility that his suffering might prevent others from enduring the same torture. If Dr. Rachel Donovan was right, if there were people willing to stand up for justice, then every moment of pain would have meaning. The DNA results would arrive at the lab within hours, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform victim into victor, expose family secrets that had been buried for decades, and prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is an unbreakable human spirit. In his cell, Calvin Price stared at the ceiling, knowing that his decision to speak out had changed everything. The fear remained, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger: the certainty that silence in the face of evil was its own form of participation. Tomorrow would bring revelations that none of them could imagine. Tonight, justice was finally stirring to life. Detective Omar Hassan stared at the DNA results for the third time, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the official laboratory report. 23 years on the force had prepared him for many shocking revelations, but this one defied all logic and reason. The fluorescent lights in his downtown precinct office cast harsh shadows across the damning evidence that would shatter multiple lives within the next hour. The genetic markers were undeniable. Dominic Vale, the young black man currently suffering systematic abuse at Millbrook Correctional Facility, was the biological son of Warden Thomas Ashworth. Hassan rubbed his temples, knowing he had to deliver this earth-shattering news immediately. The irony was almost too cruel to comprehend. While Conrad Ashworth tortured Dominic Vale daily with racist hatred, the victim was actually his own nephew. Hassan grabbed his blue jacket and headed for his unmarked vehicle. The 30-minute drive to Millbrook felt like an eternity as he rehearsed how to break this impossible news to Thomas Ashworth. The morning sun streamed through his windshield, illuminating the suburban landscape that seemed too peaceful for the storm about to unleash. At Millbrook Correctional Facility, Warden Thomas Ashworth sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing quarterly reports. When Detective Hassan arrived, Thomas wore a crisp orange dress shirt with dark blue slacks, his graying temples catching the natural light from his office windows. His corner office overlooked the prison yard, where inmates moved about their daily routines, unaware of the seismic shift about to occur in their facility's leadership structure. "Detective Hassan, what brings you here this morning?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. His voice carried the authority of 15 years running one of the state's largest correctional facilities. But Hassan detected an underlying weariness that suggested the pressures of reform were taking their toll. Hassan placed the sealed envelope on Thomas's desk with ceremonial gravity. "Sir, I need you to sit down for this. The DNA results from the cold case database have revealed something extraordinary. His voice carried the weight of impending revelation as Thomas opened the envelope with steady hands that would soon begin shaking. Thomas scanned the laboratory letterhead, then the genetic analysis, his eyes moving faster as comprehension dawned. The official seal of the State Forensics Laboratory validated what his mind desperately wanted to reject. According to the DNA comparison, inmate Dominic Vale shared 50% of his genetic material with Warden Thomas Robert Ashworth. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking as he reread the results. "There has to be some mistake, some contamination in the lab. I don't have a son. I've never had children." Hassan leaned forward, his expression grave but compassionate. "Sir, I need you to think back 24 years ago. Were you involved with anyone who might have become pregnant? Someone who might have given birth without telling you?" Thomas's face went ashen as memories crashed over him like violent waves. His hands began trembling as he set the report down, his mind racing back to his teenage years. "Jennifer Williams," he breathed, the name emerging like a long-buried secret. "We were both 17. She disappeared during senior year, said she was moving to live with relatives in another state." The flashback hit him with devastating clarity. Jennifer had been acting strange for weeks before her sudden departure, refusing his calls and avoiding him at school. Her best friend had mentioned something about Jennifer being sick, but Thomas had assumed it was just teenage drama. He had searched for her after graduation, even hired a private investigator years later. But Jennifer Williams had vanished completely from his life. "She must have been pregnant," Thomas continued, his voice hollow with realization. "She gave birth and abandoned the baby at the hospital rather than tell me. All these years I had a son and never knew." Hassan nodded grimly. According to hospital records from 24 years ago, an infant male was abandoned at Metropolitan General Hospital. The baby was placed in foster care within 48 hours and later adopted by Maria Santos, who named him Dominic Vale. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing behind his desk as the full horror of the situation crystallized. His biological son had been suffering systematic torture and abuse for months, while he remained obliviously committed to prison reform and justice. The irony was so cruel, it felt like divine punishment for some unknown sin. A sharp knock interrupted his spiral of guilt and self-recrimination. Dr. Rachel Donovan entered without waiting for permission, her red blouse wrinkled from long hours in the medical facility, and her expression carrying the urgency of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. "Warden Ashworth, I need to speak with you immediately about Dominic Vale," she announced, then noticed Detective Hassan and the scattered papers on the desk. "I have medical evidence of systematic abuse that demands immediate action." Thomas gestured weakly to another chair, his world collapsing as Dr. Donovan spread photographs and medical reports across his desk. The images showed bruises, cuts, and injuries that spoke of calculated cruelty rather than random prison violence. Her detailed documentation revealed a pattern of abuse spanning several months, escalating in severity and frequency. "These injuries are consistent with systematic torture," Dr. Donovan explained, pointing to specific photographs. "Dominic Vale has endured food deprivation, physical beatings, psychological warfare, and medical neglect. Someone has been deliberately targeting him with racist hatred." Thomas stared at the photographs of his son's battered body, bile rising in his throat as paternal instincts awakened with explosive force. The young man in these images shared his jawline, his nose, even the way he held his shoulders despite the obvious pain. How had he missed the resemblance during his brief encounters with Dominic Vale? "Who is responsible for this?" Thomas demanded, though his heart already knew the devastating answer. The security footage and witness statements Dr. Donovan provided painted a clear picture of systematic abuse orchestrated by someone with significant authority and access. "Captain Conrad Ashworth has been leading these attacks," Dr. Donovan stated, watching Thomas's face carefully. He has recruited other guards and created an environment of systematic racial terrorism against your son." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. His own brother had been torturing his biological son with racist hatred, never knowing they were destroying the same bloodline they claimed to represent. The family dynamics were so twisted and cruel that Thomas felt his sanity slipping as he processed the impossible reality. Hassan and Dr. Donovan watched silently as Thomas absorbed the full scope of the tragedy. His brother Conrad, already problematic with his racist attitudes and excessive force complaints, had unknowingly been brutalizing his own nephew for months, while Thomas remained blindly supportive of family loyalty over institutional justice. "I need to confront Conrad immediately," Thomas announced, his voice carrying new steel as paternal rage began overwhelming his shock. "Dr. Donovan, please ensure Dominic Vale receives immediate medical attention and protective custody. Detective Hassan, I want a full criminal investigation launched within the hour." The walk to Conrad's office felt like a funeral march as Thomas struggled to control his emotions. His brother's domain reflected his personality, authoritarian, cold, and filled with symbols of power and control. Conrad sat behind his metal desk, wearing his short-sleeved uniform shirt, reviewing shift schedules with the casual indifference of someone comfortable wielding absolute authority over vulnerable populations. "Conrad, we need to talk," Thomas announced, closing the door behind him with deliberate force. His brother looked up with mild annoyance, clearly expecting another administrative discussion about policies or procedures. "What's got you worked up, Thomas?" Conrad asked, not bothering to stand or show respect for his superior's rank. The casual dismissal was typical of their lifelong dynamic, where Conrad's resentment of his older brother's success created constant tension. Thomas threw the DNA results and medical photographs across Conrad's desk with explosive force. "Dominic Vale is my biological son, and you've been torturing him for months with your racist hatred." Conrad glanced at the papers with growing comprehension, but instead of shock or remorse, his expression hardened into something uglier than Thomas had ever witnessed. The revelation that his victims shared their bloodline seemed to intensify rather than diminish his hatred. "So the little ghetto rat is your bastard son," Conrad sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "That makes it even better. Maybe now you'll understand why I've been teaching him his proper place in the world." Thomas stared at his brother in horror, realizing that Conrad's racism ran deeper than institutional bias or learned prejudice. This was fundamental hatred that wouldn't be swayed by blood relations or family loyalty. Conrad actually seemed pleased that he had been torturing his own nephew, as if it validated his twisted worldview. "You're sick, Conrad. You've been torturing my son, your own nephew, and you show no remorse whatsoever." Thomas's voice carried disbelief and growing rage as he recognized the monster his brother had become. Conrad leaned back in his chair with casual indifference, his racism now fully exposed and unashamed. "He's still black, Thomas. DNA doesn't change that. If anything, it proves that our family line has been contaminated. I was doing you a favor by trying to break him." The words hit Thomas like physical violence, shattering any remaining illusion about his brother's character or their family bond. Conrad's hatred was so deep and systematic that biological relationships meant nothing compared to his racist ideology. "You're relieved of duty immediately," Thomas announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Security will escort you from the premises, and you're banned from contact with any inmates pending criminal investigation." Conrad stood slowly, his expression shifting from casual indifference to dangerous anger. "You can't protect him forever, Thomas. There are others who share my views, and they won't forget this betrayal of everything our family represents." Thomas watched his brother leave under armed escort, knowing their relationship was permanently destroyed. The man he had grown up with, shared holidays and family memories with, had revealed himself as someone capable of torturing his own blood relative without remorse. Meanwhile, in the medical facility, Dominic Vale sat on an examination table as Dr. Donovan gently cleaned his latest injuries. The natural light streaming through the windows illuminated his face as she prepared to deliver news that would change his understanding of everything he had endured. "Dominic, there's something you need to know about your biological family," she began carefully, watching his expression shift from casual attention to focused intensity as she explained the DNA results and their shocking implications. Dominic stared at her in stunned silence, processing the revelation that his tormentor was actually his uncle, while the warden who had seemed distant but fair was his biological father. The complexity of emotions was overwhelming. Anger at years of abandonment, curiosity about his genetic heritage, and confusion about how to reconcile family bonds with justice demands. The truth had finally emerged, but it brought more questions than answers, as Dominic Vale struggled to understand his place in a family structure built on both love and hatred. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Warden Thomas Ashworth's office, casting long rectangles of natural light across the polished wooden floor. Thomas sat behind his desk, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and black slacks, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged photographs on the desktop. Each image told a story of searching, of hope deferred, of a young man who had spent 23 years believing his son was lost forever. The knock on his door came at exactly 9 o'clock. "Come in," Thomas called, his voice barely steady. Dr. Rachel Donovan entered first, wearing her standard red blouse and black pants, her expression gentle but watchful. Behind her walked Dominic Vale, moving carefully due to his healing injuries, dressed in an orange prison uniform top and matching pants. The fluorescent lights overhead combined with the natural skylight to illuminate every detail of this impossible moment. Two men who shared blood but nothing else, meeting for the first time as father and son. "Please, sit down," Thomas said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. The words felt inadequate, almost absurd given the circumstances. Dominic remained standing, his dark eyes studying Thomas's face with a mixture of curiosity and guarded hostility. "So you're supposed to be my father," he said, his voice flat. "The man who's been running this place while your brother tried to kill me." Thomas flinched as if struck. "Dominic, I know how this must look. I know you have every right to hate me, but I swear to you, I had no idea what Conrad was doing, and I had no idea you were my son." "Convenient," Dominic replied, finally taking a seat. "Real convenient timing on that DNA test." Dr. Rachel Donovan cleared her throat gently. "Dominic, I was the one who submitted your DNA sample for the cold case database. It was routine procedure, nothing more. Nobody could have orchestrated this." Thomas picked up one of the photographs, his hands still shaking. "Your mother was Jennifer Williams. We were 18, seniors in high school. She was beautiful, brilliant, wanted to be a doctor." He held out the picture, showing a young Hispanic woman with kind eyes and Dominic's same strong jawline. "When she told me she was pregnant, I was scared but excited. We made plans." Dominic stared at the photograph but didn't take it. "What happened?" "She disappeared one night, left a note saying she couldn't do it, couldn't be a mother, couldn't tie me down to a life I didn't choose." Thomas's voice cracked. "I looked everywhere for her, for both of you. I hired private investigators, checked hospital records, filed missing person reports. For years I searched." "And you never found anything?" Thomas shook his head. "She gave birth at St. Mary's Hospital under a false name, listed the father as unknown. The baby you were placed in emergency custody when she disappeared from the hospital. Within days you were placed with the Santos family for adoption." He picked up another photograph, this one of himself at 19, holding a baby blanket. "I kept this. It was the only thing she left behind." Despite himself, Dominic leaned forward to look at the image. Something in Thomas's eyes, The raw pain of decades-old loss made his defensive walls crack slightly. "You really didn't know?" "I never stopped looking," Thomas whispered. "Even after I became warden, I used every resource I had. I thought about you every day, wondered what kind of man you'd become, hoped you were happy and safe." His voice broke completely. "And all this time, you were here, suffering, and I was too blind to see it." The office door burst open without warning. Maria Santos rushed in, her red dress wrinkled from the long drive, her eyes fierce with protective fury. At 55, she moved with the determination of a woman who had spent 23 years loving and defending her son. "Where is he?" she demanded, scanning the room until her gaze landed on Dominic. "Mijo, are you all right?" "When they called me, when they told me what happened," she crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped Dominic in her arms, ignoring his prison uniform, his injuries, everything except the fact that her son needed her. "I'm okay, Mama," Dominic said softly, allowing himself to relax into her embrace for the first time in months. "I'm okay." Maria Santos turned to face Thomas, her expression shifting to protective suspicion. "So you're the one claiming to be his father?" "Mrs. Santos," Thomas began, rising from his chair, "I can't begin to express my gratitude for everything you've done for Dominic. You gave him the love and family I couldn't provide. I'm not here to replace you or take anything away from what you've built together." "Good," Maria replied firmly. "Because Dominic is my son, biology or no biology. I raised him, I protected him. I was there for every scraped knee and graduation and heartbreak." She studied Thomas's face carefully. "But I can see the resemblance now. Around the eyes." Dr. Rachel Donovan stepped forward. "Mrs. Santos, Warden Ashworth has been fully cooperative with our investigation. The moment he learned about Captain Conrad Ashworth's abuse, he removed him from duty and granted me full access to build our case." "Speaking of which," Thomas said, reaching for his phone, "I need to update you both on the latest developments." He dialed Detective Omar Hassan's number, putting the call on speaker. "Hassan here. Detective, I have Dominic and his mother here. Can you share what you've learned about Conrad's current situation?" Hassan's voice came through clearly. "It's not good news for Captain Conrad Ashworth, that's for sure. We've interviewed 12 current and former inmates who confirm a pattern of racially motivated abuse spanning at least 5 years. 3 guards have agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. Officer Linda Frost is cooperating fully, providing details about systematic cover-ups and falsified reports." Maria Santos squeezed Dominic's hand. "And what about my son's original case, the robbery charges?" "Attorney Benjamin Park has agreed to take the case pro bono. Preliminary review suggests serious prosecutorial misconduct in the original trial. We're confident the conviction will be overturned within 90 days. Thomas felt a spark of hope. "What about the criminal charges against Conrad?" "Federal prosecutors are filing civil rights violation charges tomorrow. The state is pursuing assault, attempted murder, and conspiracy charges. We're looking at serious prison time." After ending the call, Thomas turned back to Dominic. "I know this doesn't erase what happened. I know I failed to protect you when you needed protection most. But I want you to know that I'm using every resource at my disposal to make sure Conrad faces justice." Dominic studied his biological father's face for a long moment. "Why should I trust you? Your brother spent months trying to break me, telling me my father abandoned me, that nobody cared if I lived or died. Now I'm supposed to believe you're different?" "You shouldn't trust me," Thomas replied honestly. "Not yet. Trust has to be earned, and I haven't earned it. But I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to try." Meanwhile, 3 floors below, in the guard locker room, Captain Conrad Ashworth paced like a caged animal, his short-sleeved uniform shirt soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning. Around him sat 5 guards, the only ones willing to still associate with him, all wearing the same nervous expressions of men watching their world crumble. "This is temporary," Conrad snarled, his face red with rage. "Some DNA test doesn't change anything. That boy is still a convicted criminal, still a threat to order in this facility." Officer Linda Frost's former partner, Officer Mike Stevens, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Conrad, maybe it's time to cut our losses. Linda's already talking to the feds. If we cooperate now—" "Cooperate?" Conrad's voice rose to a shout. "Cooperate with what? With them painting us as the criminals? With watching everything we've built here get torn down by some bleeding heart liberals and their pet project?" The guards exchanged worried glances. Conrad's racism had always been barely contained, but now it was spilling out in increasingly dangerous ways. "Look," said guard Nathan Cole, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Conrad's methods. "Maybe the warden's right. Maybe we went too far." Conrad's eyes narrowed as he focused on Nathan. "Went too far? We maintained discipline. We kept order. We made sure these animals knew their place." His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "And if any of you are thinking about turning on me like Linda did, remember this. I know where you live. I know where your families live." The room fell silent. Nathan Cole stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing in that moment. "Are you threatening us, Conrad?" "I'm reminding you about loyalty," Conrad replied. "About brotherhood. About what happens to rats." Nathan walked toward the door, then turned back. "I think I'm done here. And Conrad, if anything happens to my family, if so much as a hair on their heads is touched, I'll make sure the FBI knows exactly who to look at." As Nathan left, the remaining guards began to understand that their captain wasn't just facing professional consequences. He was becoming genuinely dangerous. Back in Thomas's office, the conversation had grown more comfortable. Maria Santos had softened slightly as she watched Thomas interact with Dominic, seeing genuine remorse and paternal concern in his manner. "What happens now?" Dominic asked. "I mean, after all this legal stuff is over?" Thomas looked at Maria, then back at his son. "That's entirely up to you. I don't expect anything from you, Dominic. I don't expect forgiveness or instant family bonds or anything else. I just want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You have choices now." Maria Santos smiled for the first time since arriving. He's always had family. But maybe now he has more family. Dr. Rachel Donovan checked her watch. "I hate to interrupt, but we should discuss security measures. Captain Conrad Ashworth is becoming increasingly unstable. His threats are escalating, and with media attention starting to focus on this story, we need to consider Dominic's safety." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've already arranged for Dominic to be moved to a protected housing unit. Round-the-clock supervision by guards who've been thoroughly vetted. Conrad and his remaining supporters will have zero access." "What about after I'm released?" Dominic asked. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Thomas replied. "But you won't face this alone. That's a promise." As the meeting concluded, Dominic stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Thomas," he said, not quite ready to say father, but no longer able to maintain complete hostility. "Thank you for listening, for trying." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for giving me a chance." As Dr. Rachel Donovan escorted Dominic back to his new housing unit, and Maria Santos prepared for the drive home, Thomas sat alone in his office, staring at the photographs of the woman he had loved and the son he had unknowingly failed to protect. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, but for the first time in months, Thomas Ashworth felt a tentative hope breaking through the darkness. The reckoning was just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the district attorney's office as Detective Omar Hassan spread the case files across the polished conference table. The overhead fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows on the photographs of Dominic Vale's injuries, each image a testament to months of systematic torture. District Attorney Jennifer Williams, wearing a crisp red blazer over black slacks, reviewed the evidence with the focused intensity of someone who had seen too many cases of injustice slip through the cracks. "We have enough evidence to file criminal charges against 5 individuals," Detective Hassan announced, his green polo shirt and dark slacks crisp despite the early hour. Captain Conrad Ashworth, Officer Linda Frost, and guards Marcus Webb, Tony Sullivan, and Derek Hayes. The federal civil rights violations alone carry 25 years. Dr. Rachel Donovan sat beside him, her red blouse and black pants professional yet comfortable. Her medical documentation had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "The pattern of abuse is undeniable," she said, pointing to a series of photographs. "Bruising patterns consistent with repeated beatings, malnutrition from food deprivation, psychological trauma markers. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated, systematic torture." District Attorney Martinez nodded grimly. "File all charges immediately. I want arrest warrants issued today." 3 hours later, the corridors of Millbrook Correctional buzzed with unprecedented activity. FBI agents in their muscular builds and tactical gear moved through the facility like a precision strike team. Agent Sarah Mitchell, her red FBI windbreaker unmistakable, led the team toward the guard station where Captain Conrad Ashworth sat, reviewing duty rosters, oblivious to the storm about to engulf him. "Captain Conrad Ashworth, you're under arrest for violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit assault, and aggravated battery," Agent Mitchell announced, her voice cutting through the morning routine like a blade. Conrad Ashworth's face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I've served this department for 15 years. You're arresting me on the word of some criminal?" "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Mitchell continued, ignoring his protests as she secured the handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Conrad Ashworth was led away, his voice echoed through the corridor with venom that shocked even the seasoned officers. "This is what happens when we let these people think they matter. Mark my words, this won't stand." Officer Linda Frost, arrested simultaneously in the parking lot, broke down immediately. Her orange uniform top and dark pants were soaked with sweat as she was placed in the back of the FBI vehicle. Unlike Conrad Ashworth's defiant rage, her face showed the terror of someone who realized the gravity of their choices. In his office, Warden Thomas Ashworth watched the arrests through his window, his blue jacket hanging loose on his shoulders, as if the weight of recent revelations had physically diminished him. Attorney Benjamin Park, wearing a green dress shirt and black slacks, sat across from his desk with a stack of legal documents. "Thomas, you need to recuse yourself from the internal investigation," Attorney Park advised. "Any involvement could compromise both the criminal case and Dominic's civil lawsuit." "I understand," Thomas replied, his voice hollow. "I've already drafted my recusal letter. Deputy Warden Morrison will oversee the internal review." He paused, staring at his hands. "How is this going to affect Dominic's wrongful conviction appeal?" "Actually, it's going to help significantly," Attorney Park said, a note of optimism creeping into his voice. "The publicity around this case has drawn attention from the Innocence Project and several high-profile civil rights organizations. We've uncovered evidence that Detective Ray Murphy, who arrested Dominic, has a history of falsifying reports and coercing confessions, particularly from young black men." Meanwhile, in the prison's medical wing, Calvin Price sat nervously in the bright examination room as Dr. Rachel Donovan prepared him for his testimony. The overhead fluorescent lights made everything sharp and clinical, but her gentle demeanor helped ease his anxiety. "Calvin, I know you're scared," Dr. Rachel Donovan said, adjusting her stethoscope around her neck. "But your testimony is crucial. You witnessed things that no one else saw. Calvin Price, wearing the standard orange prison top and blue pants, fidgeted with his hands. Doc, you don't understand. I've seen what happens to snitches in here. Even with Conrad gone, his buddies are still around. That's why you're being moved to protective custody until the trial, she assured him. And after your testimony, there's a good chance your cooperation will help with your own case review. I keep thinking about all the times I could have spoken up sooner, Calvin said, his voice thick with regret. Maybe if I had said something earlier, Dominic wouldn't have suffered as much. The important thing is that you're speaking up now, Dr. Rachel Donovan replied. That takes real courage, Calvin. Don't underestimate that. Across town, Guard Nathan Cole sat in Detective Hassan's office, natural skylight from the large windows mixing with the overhead fluorescent lighting to create an atmosphere of transparency that felt appropriate for his testimony. Nathan wore his green civilian shirt and dark jeans, having requested personal time to meet with investigators. I've been working corrections for 8 years, Nathan explained to Detective Hassan. I've seen rough treatment before, but what Conrad was doing to that kid was something else entirely. It was personal. It was evil. Detective Hassan leaned forward. Can you describe specific incidents you witnessed? The worst was about 3 weeks before the big beating that put Dominic in the hospital, Nathan said, his hands clasped tightly. Conrad had him in the shower room, said he was conducting a random search, but there were no cameras back there. I heard the kids screaming, and when I came around the corner, Conrad was pressing his baton against Dominic's throat, calling him things I won't repeat. Did you report this incident? Nathan's face filled with shame. No, I was a coward. Conrad had made it clear that anyone who crossed him would find themselves facing disciplinary action or worse. He had connections throughout the system. But you're testifying now, Detective Hassan observed. Finding out that kid was the warden's son changed everything for me, Nathan replied. Not because of who his father is, but because it made me realize how easily it could have been anyone's son. How easily it could be my son someday if I don't stand up now. The local news coverage began that evening, with reporter Jennifer Walsh standing outside the prison gates as the sun cast natural light across the scene. Her red blazer was professional and authoritative as she addressed the camera. This is a story that has rocked the community of Millbrook, she reported. 5 corrections officers, including a captain with 15 years of service, have been arrested on federal civil rights charges stemming from the systematic abuse of an inmate who has since been revealed to be the biological son of the prison warden. The story spread like wildfire across social media and news networks. Community leader Margaret Thompson, wearing a red cardigan over her white blouse, organized a rally outside the courthouse. Over 300 people gathered, holding signs demanding justice and prison reform. This isn't just about one young man, Margaret addressed the crowd through a megaphone. This is about a system that allowed racial hatred to flourish in the shadows. This is about making sure it never happens again. Civil rights attorney Jasmine Carter, her red suit jacket sharp against the natural daylight, held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Dominic Vale's case represents everything wrong with our criminal justice system. Wrongfully convicted, then tortured by racist guards while his own father unknowingly ran the institution. This demands not just individual justice, but systematic reform. Inside his hospital room, Dominic Vale watched the news coverage with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. The afternoon sunlight streamed through his window, mixing with the overhead fluorescent lights to create a bright, hopeful atmosphere that seemed at odds with everything he had endured. Maria Santos, his adoptive mother, sat beside his bed, wearing a red sweater and dark slacks. She had driven 6 hours to be with him as the media storm erupted. "Mijo, are you ready for all this attention?" she asked, squeezing his hand. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this," Dominic replied. "But Dr. Rachel Donovan says my story might help other people who went through the same thing. If that's true, then maybe all of this suffering wasn't completely pointless. Thomas Ashworth appeared in the doorway, wearing his standard blue warden's jacket over a white shirt and dark pants. The awkwardness between them was still palpable, but there was something different now, something that resembled the beginning of understanding. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Thomas said carefully. "Come in," Dominic replied, and Maria Santos nodded her approval. "I wanted you to know that the internal investigation has uncovered evidence of abuse against at least 12 other inmates over the past 3 years, Thomas reported. All young black men, all cases where Conrad manipulated the paperwork to cover his tracks. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Maria Santos covered her mouth in horror, while Dominic's hands clenched into fists. 12 others, Dominic repeated slowly. 12 other families who went through what we went through. The district attorney is reviewing all their cases, Thomas continued, and I've implemented immediate policy changes. All disciplinary actions now require video documentation and witness verification. No guard can be alone with an inmate during any kind of physical intervention. "That's good," Dominic said, though his voice carried the weight of knowing it came too late for him and the others. Dr. Rachel Donovan entered the room, her red medical coat bright under the fluorescent lighting. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give you an update on the federal investigation. The Department of Justice is sending a team to conduct a full review of Millbrook's policies and practices. This case has become a catalyst for examining conditions throughout the state prison system." The scope of change beginning to ripple outward from Dominic's suffering was both encouraging and overwhelming. As evening approached and the natural light faded, leaving only the bright overhead fluorescence, the small group in the hospital room represented something powerful. A family rebuilding itself around truth and justice, supported by allies who had chosen courage over complicity. Attorney Benjamin Park arrived with more updates. Conrad's lawyer tried to get him released on bail, but the judge denied it. Apparently, Conrad made some statements during booking that the judge found deeply disturbing. His racism isn't something he can hide anymore. "What happens next?" Maria Santos asked. "The trial will likely begin in 6 weeks, Attorney Park explained. The prosecution's case is strong, thanks to Dr. Rachel Donovan's documentation and the brave testimony from Calvin Price and Nathan Cole. But Conrad's going to fight this with everything he has, and his defense will likely try to paint Dominic as a criminal who deserved harsh treatment." "Let them try," Dominic said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "The truth is the truth, and for the first time since this nightmare started, the truth is finally coming to light." As night fell outside the hospital windows, justice was indeed rising, carried forward by the courage of witnesses, the dedication of advocates, and the unbreakable spirit of a young man who had survived the worst humanity could offer and emerged determined to ensure it never happened again. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal courthouse as crowds gathered outside, their voices rising in chants for justice. Inside courtroom 4B, fluorescent lights cast a bright, unforgiving glow over the mahogany benches packed with reporters, community activists, and prison reform advocates. Today was the day Captain Conrad Ashworth would finally face the consequences of his systematic torture and abuse. Dominic Vale sat in the front row wearing a crisp green button-down shirt and dark blue slacks, his posture straight despite the trauma he'd endured. Beside him, his biological father, Warden Thomas Ashworth, adjusted his blue jacket nervously, knowing he would soon testify against his own brother. The weight of choosing justice over blood loyalty pressed heavily on his shoulders. Judge Frederick Ingram, a distinguished black man with decades of experience, called the court to session. His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen countless injustices and was determined to see this one properly addressed. The jury, carefully selected to represent the community's diversity, sat attentively as prosecutor Sarah Chen outlined the overwhelming evidence against the defendants. Captain Conrad Ashworth entered wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his face twisted with the same arrogant sneer he'd worn while torturing inmates. Even now, facing federal civil rights violations and assault charges, he showed no remorse. His eyes found Dominic Vale in the crowd, and his lip curled with undisguised hatred. The first witness called was Dr. Rachel Donovan, wearing a professional red blazer and black pants. Her testimony was methodical and devastating as she presented photographs of Dominic Vale's injuries, medical records documenting systematic abuse, and her own detailed observations of the prison's culture of violence. The injuries I documented were consistent with prolonged physical torture, Dr. Donovan testified, her voice steady despite the horrific images being displayed. Broken ribs that had been repeatedly re-injured, evidence of electrical burns, signs of prolonged malnutrition, and psychological trauma consistent with systematic psychological warfare. Defense attorney Marcus Reed tried desperately to discredit her testimony, suggesting that prison injuries were common and could have multiple causes. But Dr. Donovan's documentation was thorough, her professional reputation spotless, and her photographs spoke louder than any legal maneuvering. The courtroom held its collective breath as Officer Linda Frost took the stand. Wearing an orange prison uniform, she had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was the breakthrough prosecutors needed, detailing the systematic nature of the abuse and Captain Conrad Ashworth's leadership role. Captain Ashworth specifically targeted black inmates. Officer Frost testified, her voice barely above a whisper. He called it keeping them in line. He organized beatings, orchestrated food deprivation, and encouraged psychological torture. He said black inmates needed to know their place in his prison. The prosecutor pressed further. Did Captain Ashworth use racial slurs when referring to inmates? Officer Frost nodded, tears streaming down her face. Constantly. He called Dominic Vale the N-word almost daily. He said he was going to break that boy completely. He took pleasure in the abuse. Captain Conrad Ashworth's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was devastating. Officer Frost's insider knowledge revealed the calculated, premeditated nature of the torture campaign. She detailed how Captain Conrad Ashworth had recruited other guards, how he'd covered up evidence, and how he'd specifically targeted Dominic Vale with increasing violence. Calvin Price, the fellow inmate who had witnessed much of the abuse, testified next. Wearing a green shirt and blue pants, he spoke with quiet dignity about the climate of fear Captain Conrad Ashworth had created. We all knew what would happen if we spoke up, Calvin testified. Captain Ashworth made examples of people, but watching what he did to Dominic, I couldn't stay silent anymore. That young man never broke, never gave up his dignity, even when they were trying to destroy him completely. The most powerful moment came when guard Nathan Cole took the stand. His muscular frame was clothed in an orange shirt and blue jacket as he detailed his transformation from silent witness to whistleblower. I was a coward for too long, Nathan admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I watched Captain Ashworth torture that young man day after day. The captain would laugh about it, brag about breaking his spirit. He said black inmates were animals that needed to be beaten into submission. I should have stopped it sooner. The prosecutor introduced recorded conversations that Nathan had secretly captured, including one where Captain Conrad Ashworth detailed his plans to accidentally kill Dominic Vale during a staged altercation. The jury listened in horror as the defendant's voice filled the courtroom, casually discussing murder while using racial slurs. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Thomas Ashworth approached the witness stand, his blue jacket pressed, his face etched with pain and determination. The courtroom fell silent as the warden prepared to testify against his own brother. I've known my brother my entire life, Thomas began, his voice steady but filled with anguish. But the man who tortured those inmates, who tortured my son, is not someone I can defend or protect. What he did was evil, systematic, and unforgivable. The defense attorney tried to suggest that family dynamics might color his testimony, but Thomas Ashworth's integrity was unassailable. He detailed how Captain Conrad Ashworth had hidden the abuse, how the systematic torture had operated under his nose, and how his brother had shown no remorse even after learning Dominic Vale was his nephew. When I confronted Conrad about what he'd done to my son, he showed no remorse, Thomas testified, his voice breaking slightly. He said that black blood made Dominic Vale inferior regardless of genetics. He said he'd do it again. The courtroom gasped audibly at this revelation. Captain Conrad Ashworth's racism ran so deep that even biological family ties couldn't overcome his hatred. Detective Omar Hassan testified about the investigation, presenting evidence of the cover-up and the systematic nature of the abuse. Attorney Benjamin Park detailed how the wrongful conviction had made Dominic Vale vulnerable to this torture, creating a perfect storm of injustice. Then Dominic Vale himself took the stand. Wearing his green shirt and blue slacks, Dominic carried himself with a dignity that 6 months of torture hadn't been able to break. His testimony was measured, powerful, and devastating. He spoke without hatred, describing the abuse with factual precision that made it even more horrifying. Captain Ashworth told me daily that I was worthless because of my race, Dominic testified, his voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. He said my father had abandoned me because black children weren't worth raising. The irony is that his own brother was the father he was mocking. Dominic detailed the electrical shocks, the beatings, the psychological warfare designed to break his spirit. But his testimony also revealed something Captain Conrad Ashworth hadn't counted on: unbreakable inner strength. He wanted me to believe I was nothing, Dominic continued, but I knew who I was. I knew I was innocent. I knew I had value. And I knew that his hatred said more about him than about me. Every day I survived was a victory against his attempt to destroy my humanity. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint Dominic Vale as a violent criminal who deserved harsh treatment. But Dominic's calm, dignified responses only highlighted the injustice he'd suffered. When Captain Conrad Ashworth finally took the stand in his own defense, he sealed his fate completely. Arrogant and unrepentant, he denied nothing but justified everything with racist ideology that shocked even hardened court observers. Those people need firm discipline, Captain Conrad Ashworth declared, using a racial slur that caused Judge Ingram to threaten contempt charges. I don't care if he's my brother's bastard. Black blood is black blood, and they need to know their place. His attorney tried desperately to control the damage, but Captain Conrad Ashworth continued his racist rant, revealing the depth of his hatred and complete lack of remorse. The jury watched in disgust as he detailed his belief that black inmates deserved torture, that they were inherently violent and needed to be broken. The closing arguments were swift. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: recorded conversations, medical documentation, eyewitness testimony, and Captain Conrad Ashworth's own admissions. The defense had nothing but desperate appeals to sympathy that fell flat given the defendant's unrepentant racism. Judge Ingram's jury instructions were clear and comprehensive, covering federal civil rights violations, conspiracy, assault, and attempted murder charges. The jury retired for deliberation as the courtroom waited with bated breath. The wait was remarkably short. After just 3 hours, the jury returned with verdicts that sent ripples of satisfaction through the packed courtroom. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced, his voice carrying the weight of justice finally served. Captain Conrad Ashworth showed no emotion as guilty verdicts were read for federal civil rights violations, conspiracy to violate civil rights, aggravated assault, attempted murder, and official misconduct. Each verdict carried significant prison time. Judge Ingram's sentencing was swift and severe. The systematic torture you inflicted motivated by racial hatred, represents one of the most egregious violations of civil rights I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers before Judge Ingram restored order. But the day's justice wasn't finished. In a separate hearing, Dominic Vale's wrongful conviction was formally overturned based on evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and the revelation that the real perpetrator had been identified through DNA evidence. 6 months of freedom stolen, years of life derailed, all because of a system that had failed him completely. The civil lawsuit against the prison system was settled for $12 million, with agreements for comprehensive reforms, anti-racism training, and independent oversight of prison conditions. Thomas Ashworth faced disciplinary action from the State Corrections Board but retained his position due to his cooperation with the investigation and immediate implementation of reforms. His testimony against his brother had demonstrated moral courage that impressed even his critics. As the courthouse emptied, Dominic Vale stood on the steps surrounded by supporters, sunlight streaming down from overhead clouds. The young man who had entered prison 6 months ago had been transformed not into the broken victim Captain Conrad Ashworth intended, but into a powerful symbol of justice and resilience. Dr. Rachel Donovan approached, wearing her red blazer, her face beaming with satisfaction. "Justice," she said simply, and Dominic Vale nodded. Thomas Ashworth stood nearby, his blue jacket catching the afternoon light, watching his son with a mixture of pride and lingering guilt. Their relationship was still developing, still complicated by circumstances, but today had proven that some bonds transcend the worst attempts to destroy them. The reckoning was complete, but the real work of healing and reform was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell on Captain Conrad Ashworth's 25-year sentence, and the autumn morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dominic Vale's new downtown apartment painted everything in shades of hope. The 23-year-old black man stood at his kitchen counter, wearing a green sweater and dark blue jeans, reviewing architectural blueprints spread across the marble surface. These weren't just any blueprints. They were plans for the Dominic Vale Foundation headquarters, a place where wrongfully convicted inmates would find the support system he'd never had. The settlement money from his civil lawsuit had been substantial, but it was Thomas Ashworth's unwavering support that had truly enabled this transformation. His biological father had helped him navigate the complex world of nonprofit formation, introduced him to influential advocates, and most importantly, provided the emotional foundation Dominic needed to heal. Their relationship remained delicate, built on careful conversations and shared meals, but it was genuine in ways that surprised them both. Dr. Rachel Donovan knocked on the apartment door, her red blazer and black slacks a familiar sight as she balanced a stack of grant applications in her arms. She'd taken a leave of absence from prison medical services to help launch the foundation, her documentation skills now serving justice in an entirely different way. "The state board approved our trauma-informed care protocols," she announced, setting the papers on Dominic's dining table. "And the psychological evaluation program you designed is being implemented in 3 facilities next month." Dominic smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had in that first month after his release. The nightmares still visited occasionally, but they were losing their grip on his waking hours. Calvin's testimony really made the difference with the board. Having someone who lived through the system speak about witnessing courage, it changed how they see things. Calvin Price had been released 2 weeks after the trial ended, his own charges reduced in recognition of his cooperation and the courage he'd shown in finally speaking out. The former inmate now traveled to colleges and community centers, sharing his story about the moment he chose to break his silence. His orange polo shirt and blue jeans had become familiar sights at criminal justice reform conferences, where his words carried the weight of lived experience. Meanwhile, at Riverside Correctional, the morning briefing room buzzed with a different energy than it had 6 months earlier. Nathan Cole, now promoted to senior corrections officer for his integrity during the investigation, addressed a room full of guards wearing crisp uniforms under bright fluorescent lights. His muscular frame commanded respect as he reviewed the new anti-racism training protocols that Thomas Ashworth had implemented system-wide. "The old culture dies today," Nathan declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed both the darkness and the possibility for light. "Every interaction with every inmate reflects on this institution and on each of you personally. The Dominic Vale case showed us what happens when we forget that every person in our custody is someone's son, someone's daughter." The training programs were comprehensive, addressing not just explicit bias but the subtle ways prejudice infected daily interactions. Body camera requirements had been expanded, complaint procedures streamlined, and most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for racial discrimination had teeth that the previous administration's policies had lacked. In the maximum security wing of a facility 300 miles away, Captain Conrad Ashworth sat in his solitary cell, his world reduced to concrete walls and the bitter taste of consequences. The racist ideology that had driven his cruelty now offered no comfort, only the cold reality that his hatred had cost him everything: his career, his freedom, his family, and any hope of redemption. His former subordinates had abandoned him completely once the federal charges landed, and even the most prejudiced guards wanted no association with someone whose actions had brought such scrutiny to their profession. Officer Linda Frost, serving her reduced sentence in a minimum security facility, had become a cautionary tale rather than a martyr for racist ideology. Her cooperation during the investigation had saved her from Conrad's fate, but it hadn't saved her from the complete collapse of the worldview that had once made her feel superior to the inmates she was supposed to protect. Dr. Rachel Donovan's appointment to the State Prison Oversight Board had been unanimous, her reputation for unflinching documentation and medical integrity making her an obvious choice for reform-minded officials. Her red suit jacket caught the overhead lighting as she addressed the monthly board meeting, presenting statistics that showed measurable improvements in inmate health outcomes and complaint resolution rates across the facilities, implementing new protocols. The Dominic Vale case wasn't an anomaly, she explained to the assembled officials. It was the predictable result of systems that prioritized control over humanity. These reforms address root causes, not just symptoms. Thomas Ashworth had weathered his own professional scrutiny with characteristic dignity, accepting a formal reprimand for failing to detect his brother's systematic abuse while maintaining his position as warden. His reform efforts had been genuine and comprehensive, transforming not just policies but the fundamental culture of how corrections officers viewed their role. The blue jacket he wore over his white shirt had become associated with progressive leadership in correctional circles, and other wardens regularly consulted him about implementing similar changes. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Maria Santos's modest kitchen as she prepared dinner for 3, a weekly tradition that had developed over the past few months. Dominic's adoptive mother moved efficiently between the stove and counter, her red dress and comfortable shoes reflecting the warmth she'd always brought to her son's life. The woman who had raised Dominic with love and sacrifice had welcomed Thomas into these family meals with grace, understanding that healing required space for complicated relationships. When Dominic and Thomas arrived together, their conversation flowing naturally between foundation business and shared memories they were still discovering, Maria felt the deep satisfaction of watching her son reclaim joy. Thomas wore his customary blue jacket over khaki slacks, his formal bearing softened by the genuine affection growing between him and the son he'd searched for decades to find. The youth program launches next month, Dominic shared over Maria's famous chicken and rice. We're partnering with schools to teach teenagers about their rights during police encounters and how the justice system actually works. Dr. Donovan designed a curriculum that's educational without being inflammatory." Thomas nodded approvingly. Prevention work is just as important as helping people after they've been wronged. These kids deserve to understand how to protect themselves. The conversation flowed between English and Spanish. As Maria shared neighborhood news, Thomas asked about her job at the clinic, and Dominic described his upcoming speaking engagements. It was ordinary and precious. The kind of family dinner that had once seemed impossible, but now anchored all three of their lives in hope. The following evening, Dominic stood before 200 high school students in the gymnasium of Lincoln Community High School, the overhead fluorescent lights illuminating eager young faces that reminded him of his own teenage years. He wore a green button-down shirt and dark slacks, his appearance professional but approachable as he shared the story that had transformed him from victim to advocate. "6 months ago, I was in a prison cell, wrongfully convicted and systematically abused by guards who saw my skin color before they saw my humanity," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today, I stand before you not as someone defined by what was done to me, but as someone empowered by what we can do together to change systems that harm innocent people." The students listened with the intensity of young people recognizing truth, their questions afterward revealing both their sophistication and their hunger for justice. Change happens when people who care more about doing right than staying comfortable decide to act. Dominic explained to a student who asked about becoming an activist. Dr. Donovan could have stayed quiet and avoided conflict. Calvin Price could have kept his head down. Nathan Cole could have followed orders without questioning them. Thomas Ashworth could have protected his brother instead of choosing justice. Every single person has moments where they decide what kind of world they want to help create. As the evening wound down and students approached him with personal stories and thanks, Dominic felt the complete transformation of his identity. The young man who had once felt powerless and forgotten now stood as living proof that justice, though sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail. The foundation would help others navigate wrongful convictions. The reforms would protect future inmates from abuse, and his story would inspire others to believe that their voices mattered. The drive home took him past Riverside Correctional, its lights visible in the distance but no longer holding any power over his dreams. Tomorrow would bring more foundation work, another family dinner, another opportunity to turn his pain into purpose and his survival into service. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.